For those who might be sharing this service for the first time this year, we deviate from our ordinary custom in this later service and offer the sermon up front. It's a deliberate attempt to ensure that I don't put you to sleep later. The shofar has sounded. Last week, we celebrated Rosh Hashanah and reveled in the calls, Tekiyah, Shevarim, Teruah. According to the Talmud, the shofar is used very sparingly in Jewish life. A 3rd century sage, Rabbi Ada of Jaffa, asserted that there were only 3 times in the life of the community that the entirety of the shofar service should be sounded. On Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, that is the 50th year, to affirm the cancellation of all debts, and finally, in the time of war. This has been a week during which the shofar calls continued well after the new year. The reverberations transformed into somber advocacy for war as the White House sought sanction for a military strike against the Syrian regime, citing its depraved use of chemical weapons against civilians on August 21st. The murder of more than 1,400 civilians, among them more than 400 children with sarin gas, demanded response. The horrific images of disfigured children and adult civilians, victims of that attack, have been set against a backdrop of more than 100,000 deaths and the flight of 2 million Syrian refugees, more than half of them children. There is a 19th century German word used in chess and in game theory. That word is Zugzwang. Zugzwang is translated as a compulsion to move and refers to a situation in which one player is put at a disadvantage because he has to make a move when he would prefer to pass. The player must make a move despite the fact that it will weaken his position and will force a concession upon him. It is a most uncomfortable position in which to be placed. Nevertheless, as we enter Yom Kippur 5774, let us acknowledge that our nation and the world are in moral Zugzwang. 10 days ago, I swore I would not speak about this situation. I counseled my colleagues not to speak about it. My wife chimed in and said, "Whatever you do, don't get into Syria. It's a no-win." My every instinct had been to avoid this topic. Yet it feels impossible to ignore the elephant in the corner. We are immersed in moral ambiguity. The dynamic changes that have unfolded before our eyes on a minute-to-minute basis demand constant processing and reprocessing of events, analysis of presumed intentions, recalibration of tactical maneuvers and strategic goals in order to try to sort the overlapping spheres of foreign and domestic statecraft and stagecraft, and discover a moral calculus that might guide us. Examine your own reactions to the events of last week. Are you relieved that we have stepped away from unilateral action against a vicious and inhumane regime? Did you read the actions of Russian Premier Vladimir Putin, including his op-ed in the New York Times, with hope or with cynicism? Do you believe that the proper posture for the United States in the face of immense inhumanity and international avoidance is to assert its power? Or do you agree that the only path to peace is an agonizingly slow diplomatic initiative? Should the United States behave as the world's policeman? Or should we eschew that role and focus on our considerable problems here at home? There is no way that a thoughtful person can predict with certainty the unfolding of laws of intended and unintended consequences, of counter-reaction and judgment. No matter the real-time events, the coming days, weeks, and months will be fraught with an angst over potential cataclysmic consequences, regardless of the course of action that is undertaken. I have no credentials in foreign policy, international law, or national defense, and I won't abuse this pulpit by entering into that territory. There are strong moral arguments on both sides of the question whether or not to support a strike on Syria. In the end, one more opinion simply adds to the cacophony created by pundits and pandering politicians preening on both sides of the U.S. aisle. I would, however, explore with you the insight that Jewish tradition offers on the morality of war, and then suggest a spiritual strategy consistent with our tradition and with the best of American values. Jewish tradition from Talmudic times forward reflects upon different categories of war. The great medieval philosopher Moses Maimonides codified these categories in his Mishnah Torah in a section entitled Hilchot Melachim Umilchemotehem, the laws of kings and their wars. Maimonides distinguishes two types of war. The first he called Milchemet Mitzvah, an obligatory war. The second is identified as Milchemet HaReshut, a discretionary war. Put into a modern context, an obligatory or commanded war is a defensive war waged against an enemy that has attacked or is preparing to attack and thereby threatens the peace and sovereignty of the nation. The king does not require approval from a legislative or judicial body in order to initiate such a war. The response, even if preemptive, is justified by the imminent danger and the obligation for self-defense. By extension, an overt threat against a nation with whom we are formally allied may also be seen as sufficient cause to justify entry into an obligatory war. A permitted or discretionary war, sometimes referred to as an optional war, is fought for the purpose of expansion of power, territory, or international prestige. It may not be initiated by the ruler alone. The ruler must apply to the Sanhedrin for permission to lead the nation into this kind of conflict. A 2003 responsa issued by the Central Conference of American Rabbis Responsa Committee explains, consider, for example, that the king must obtain the permission of the Sanhedrin before initiating such a conflict. This requires him to appear before the prestigious judicial institution to make a compelling case for his war, and it raises the possibility that this case will fail to persuade. Consider, moreover, the exemptions from military service that are granted in a discretionary war. This means that the king must fight his war with a significantly reduced army, forcing him to think again about the advisability of initiating the conflict. These regulations, which make it much less likely that the king will engage in war unless it is absolutely necessary to do so, act as a significant brake upon his militaristic impulses. In this way, Jewish law begins to mitigate the acceptability of discretionary war. In addition, with the loss of national sovereignty and exile, the rabbis established peace as an ultimate value, the very pinnacle of their moral taxonomy. The Midrash records a stirring litany that indicates the strength of the rabbinic commitment to peace. Great is peace, for every conceivable blessing is contained therein. Great is peace, for every other ethical mitzvah is conditional. If you see, if you encounter, if you happen to discover, that is, if the occasion for the mitzvah should arise, then you must do it. But if it does not arise, you need not do it. In relation to peace, however, it is written, seek peace and pursue it. Seek peace in your own place and pursue it to another place as well. Great is peace, for even in a time of war, one must begin with an offer of peace. Shalom is one of the names by which the rabbis called God, but they go even further and assert that Shalom is the name of the Messiah and the name of Israel as well. In other words, peace is not only coextensive with the divine, it is a condition of redemption and salvation, and consequently at the very epicenter of Israel's mission in the world. The 15th century Spanish rabbi Isaac Arama asserted that peace could not be achieved without addressing the reform of the social order. He wrote, "If the social order and law are corrupt, rancor and deception will necessarily follow. Such strife inevitably spreads to become major wars that destroy civilization." He interprets the biblical injunction to seek peace and pursue it. He writes, "One may not say it is sufficient to attempt to arbitrate between the antagonists and to reconcile them if they should happen to come before me. This is true even more in the case of wars between peoples and governments, for the greater they are, the greater the misdeeds and suffering. Even if one determines to resolve a conflict by war, he is first obligated to seek peace and pursue it." Set against the preponderant weight of Jewish thought supporting the ideal of peace is this Talmudic dictum. The Mishnah asserts that there are two situations in which one is compelled to kill another, and they are when there is no other way to prevent a person from committing murder or rape against an innocent victim. The Talmud asks, how do we justify the decision to kill the would-be perpetrator, and answers with the obligation established in the Holiness Code, which we shall read tomorrow afternoon. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. As Jews, have we not condemned the silence of the world in the early stages of the Nazi genocide, decrying international inaction with the words, "Never again"? How do we reconcile the tension between these two moral values? Is this not the dilemma by which we are now confronted? There is no easy resolution. If you feel the tension between these two demands, you may in this moment discover a greater sympathy for the vacillation by our president. In a search for guidance, permit me to conclude with the words of two moral giants of 20th century thought, Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Buber, and encourage you to choose between them. In this 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, there has been repeated reference to King's great "I Have a Dream" speech. But I want to reference here an equally great speech, A Time to Break Silence, delivered by King at the Riverside Church in New York City on April 4th, 1967. He said, "There is an invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. Omar Khayyam is right. The moving finger writes, and having writ, moves on. We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace and justice throughout the developing world, a world that borders on our doors. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time, reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight." Martin Buber responded to an article that Mahatma Gandhi had written in 1938 in his paper, in which he counseled the Jews of Germany to use satyagraha, nonviolent resistance against the Nazis. In a letter to Gandhi dated February 24, 1939, Buber wrote, "We have not proclaimed as you do and as did Jesus, the Son of our people, the teaching of nonviolence. We believe that a man must sometimes use force to save himself, or even more, his children. I cannot help withstanding evil when I see that evil is about to destroy the good. I am forced to withstand evil in the world, just as the evil within myself. I can only strive not to have to do so by force. I do not want force, but if there is no other way of preventing the evil destroying the good, I trust I shall use force and give myself up into God's hands." Buber was a true Ohev Shalom, a true lover of peace, but he believed, not without anguish, that peace at any price was not a moral option. Which of these models is the right course to choose? King's nonviolent resistance to evil, or Buber's terrible truth that despite our misgivings, there are times that we must be prepared to subdue evil with force and then give ourselves up into God's hands? This is a conversation worthy of our time and our continuing deliberation. As we immerse ourselves in Yom Kippur's metaphors of good and evil, life and death, apathy and redemption, may our decisions and our actions be both guided and limited by moral necessity. May the path that we choose for ourselves and our children in the end lead us ever closer to the path of peace. We continue on page 253 and